Welcome. Tonight, we step into a Viking village at dusk, where firelight, quiet rituals, and fading voices guide us through an evening shaped by nature, belief, and calm. As the sun slowly leaned toward the northern horizon, a soft amber light spread over the Viking village. In these lands ruled all day by harsh winds and salty sea air, evening always arrived with a special kind of silence, not completely quiet, yet not as loud as the day, somewhere in between, a moment where humans and nature breathed in the same rhythm. From a distance, the village consisted of long houses placed irregularly yet deliberately. The wooden walls had darkened over the years from wind and rain, and the roofs were covered with layers of grass. This grass was not only for insulation, but also part of their unity with nature. For the Vikings, a home was not a structure separated from nature, it was its continuation. As evening approached, the last movements could be seen in the fields surrounding the village. Bundles of barley and rye were gathered. Animals were slowly guided back to their pens. As cattle, sheep, and goats returned at a steady pace from the pastures where they had grazed all day, the deep sound of bells echoed into the village. This sound was familiar to the villagers. It was another way of saying, "The day is ending." In villages by the sea, the shore offered an entirely different scene. Long ships were pulled onto the beach by returning fishermen, and nets were carefully gathered. The smell of fish mixed with salt and seaweed and spread through the air. To a modern person, this scent might feel heavy, but for Vikings it was the smell of abundance and life. Within the village, children's voices gradually faded and eventually stopped. Children who had run across the soil all day, playing with wooden swords, were called back into the houses by their mothers. Evening was not a time when discipline hardened. It was the moment rituals began. Everyone had their place. Everyone knew what to do. The inside of the longhouses was far warmer and more alive than it appeared from outside. In the center was a long fire pit, with smoke slowly slipping out through small openings in the roof. Along the walls were wooden benches covered with animal hides. These hides were not only for sitting, but also for sleeping at night. The house was at the same time a kitchen, a bedroom, and a gathering place. Women usually tended to the evening meal, but this was not a passive role. In Viking society, women were strong. They were responsible for the order of the household, the keys, and often economic decisions. Soups simmered in large cauldrons, prepared with meat and root vegetables. There were no spices, but the flavor was deep. Every bite was the result of effort. Men either talked about the day's work or sat quietly around the fire. The idea that Vikings were constantly at war is an exaggeration of modern narratives. Yes, they were warriors, but they were also farmers, fishermen, traders, and family people. Evening hours, especially in times of peace, were when calm was felt most intensely. The sound of the fire was like the heartbeat of the village. Outside, the wind blew, gently moving the grass on the roofs. Inside, time did not flow. No one hurried, because once darkness fell, there was little that could be done. Light was precious, energy had to be preserved. During these hours, the elders of the village usually spoke. Sunset was the time for stories. Old voyages, lost companions, distant lands once seen. These narratives were not only entertainment, but also memory. In a world where written culture was limited, history was passed on by the fire. As the sky outside slowly darkened, stars began to appear. The northern sky, especially on clear nights, had a depth that forced silence upon those who looked at it. Vikings knew the sky. They could read the stars to find direction, calculate time, and survive sea journeys. As evening progressed, the village became completely different from the harshness of the day. There was no war, no urgency, only fire, breathing people, and the weight of the approaching night. This was the beginning of an evening in Viking villages. Night had not yet fully fallen, and there was much still to be told. When night fell, the village did not sink into total darkness. In the Viking world, darkness was not an absolute end. It was a state where light was used carefully. Fires inside the longhouses continued to burn, their lights slowly dancing on the walls. Shadows stretched and shrank, sometimes making a person appear larger than they were. These shadows were the natural backdrop of stories. Sitting by the fire was more than a habit. It was the moment when the village's consciousness gathered. During the day, everyone scattered in different directions, but in the evening, everyone met in the same circle, minds settling into a similar calm. No one said, "Now I am telling a story." Stories emerged spontaneously from conversations. An old man would take a deep sip from his wooden cup, then begin to speak without any hurry. He did not need to raise his voice. The crackling of the fire and the attentive listening of others created enough space. What he told was sometimes a journey, sometimes a mistake, sometimes a warning. Viking stories were not always about heroism. Often they were about knowing the limits of what one could do. For children, these stories were tales. For adults, warnings. The price of courage, the consequence of greed, the importance of loyalty. These were not abstract concepts, but lessons conveyed through lived examples. No one intended to teach a lesson, yet everyone learned one. Women often remained silent around the fire, but this was not withdrawal. In silence, they observed everything around them. Who said what? Who reacted how? Social balance was preserved through this subtle awareness. In Viking society, power did not mean speaking loudly. On some evenings, stories gave way to songs. Simple humming, repeated lines. There was no professional performance. If someone sang, others either joined in or listened. The songs were mostly about the sea, journeys, or losses. There were cheerful ones too, but melancholy always found a way to show itself. Rituals were performed during these hours. Not grand ceremonies, small personal habits. Someone adding an extra piece of wood to the fire, another drawing a small symbol near the door. These were not direct prayers to the gods, but rather efforts of remembrance. For Vikings, gods were not extremely distant. They existed within nature, within daily life. In some houses, small offerings were prepared. A piece of bread, a cup of drink, or a small portion of meat. These were not showy, but their value was great. They were modest gestures for continued abundance, safe journeys, or a mild coming winter. If the wind outside was strong, the fire inside was protected more carefully. On cold winter nights, the fire must not go out. Fire was not only for warmth, but to feel that time was continuing. If the flame died, the night felt heavier. Children at this time were usually drowsy on the benches. The stories echoed differently in their world. A dragon or a distant island slipped into their dreams. Viking children were not raised with fear, but neither were they shielded from reality. The world was dangerous, yes, but it was livable. Some evenings were quieter than usual, especially after a poor harvest or the death of someone in the village. Then little was spoken by the fire. Silence was a sign of respect. No one wanted to break it because everyone shared the same feeling. Outside the longhouse, the village showed another face. If there was moonlight, the grass-covered roofs shimmered. If not, the darkness was deeper, but it was not frightening. Villagers had learned to live with darkness. Night was not the time of enemies. It was the time of sleep. Dogs lay near their shelters, occasionally barking at distant sounds. These sounds were usually an animal, sometimes just the wind playing tricks. But the village was not completely defenseless. There was a system of watch. Not everyone could sleep at the same time. As conversations by the fire faded, people withdrew to their places. Someone checked the fire. Someone tightly closed the door. These movements were automatic. Repeated for generations, they required no thought. The night was moving on. But in Viking villages, night did not mean only sleep. Night was the time to turn inward, and they had not yet entered the deepest hours of the night. Night had now fully settled over the village. Most fires were nearly gone, burning only as embers. Sounds inside the longhouses had almost disappeared. Occasionally the faint crack of wood would be heard, then silence would return. In Viking villages, night was not a feared time. Darkness was not fought. People were accustomed to living alongside it. When eyes closed, the world did not disappear. It simply shifted into another rhythm. The movement of day gave way to the slowness of night. Inside the longhouses, people slept close together. This was both a necessity and a test of trust. Cold felt harsher alone. Sleeping together protected not only the body, but the mind as well. Breathing gradually synchronized, and the village rested almost like a single organism. Dreams were not simple things for Vikings. Dreaming was not seen as a random mental image. Dreams could carry messages. Repeating dreams were taken especially seriously. In the morning, some dreams were remembered silently, others shared. Dreams were not always associated with gods. Sometimes a sea appeared, sometimes a forgotten path, sometimes a meeting yet to happen. But the Viking mind did not consider these images empty. The idea that everything could be a sign increased the weight of the night. Throughout the night, the village was not left unguarded. There were watchmen, usually positioned near the outskirts, at slightly elevated points. With spear or axe in hand, eyes adjusted to the darkness. For them, night was a test of staying awake. Even when sleep pressed in, eyes had to remain open. Standing watch was not a punishment, but a responsibility. Those who took on this duty knew they were protecting the continuity of the village. During the hours spent in darkness, surroundings were listened to, the sound of the wind distinguished, unusual movement noticed. Most nights nothing happened, but that did not make the watch unnecessary. The moon sometimes hid behind clouds, sometimes shone openly. Moonlight made the village silhouette clearer. Longhouses, fences, barns, all were reshaped by shadows. Places familiar by day gained different meanings at night. Animals were also part of the night. Horses lay in their stalls. Sheep pressed tightly together. Animal restlessness was assigned to humans. If animals became uneasy without reason, something might be wrong. That was why night sounds were listened to more carefully. When the wind blew from the north, the air grew colder. This wind carried the smell of the sea, salty, sharp, and cold. In villages near the coast, this smell entered even sleep. For Vikings, the sea was not only a livelihood, but part of their memories. This was the main reason it appeared so often in dreams. As the night progressed, the sense of time blurred. Hours were not as clearly separated as during the day. One moment felt long, another short. For those sleeping, time stopped. For those awake, night became a measure of patience. Some people woke during the night to check the fire, step outside for fresh air. or simply think. These awakenings were not panicked. They were quiet, controlled, and routine. Returning to sleep followed the same calm. Night was when thoughts intensified. Thoughts suppressed during the day surfaced more strongly at night. The coming winter, an approaching journey, family issues. These were not spoken but felt. For Vikings, facing the inner world was unavoidable. Night made it easier. The forest outside the village looked more frightening at night. The darkness between the trees represented the unknown. But this unknown was not hostile. The forest was an area to be respected, entered by day, kept at a distance by night. On cloudless nights, stars became clear. Vikings knew the sky. Stars were not just decoration. They were tools for navigation. But night was less about finding direction and more about resting. Looking at the sky made a person feel small, yet safe. And slowly, the deepest hours of night arrived. During these hours, the village seemed to hold its breath. But this silence was not an end. It was preparation for morning. Toward morning. Life after silence. After the darkest hours passed, the village began to change, unnoticed. There was no light yet, but the darkness was no longer as deep. In these hours, the world did not wake. It prepared. In Viking villages, morning was not a sudden beginning, but a gentle transition. The first to wake were the elderly. Their sleep was lighter. They quietly sat up inside the longhouse, checking the fire. There was no flame, only embers. Those embers were a memory left from the night. It was important that they had not fully gone out, because keeping the fire alive meant continuity of life. Outside, the air was cold, the ground frozen, the air heavy. When breathing in, a coolness filled the lungs. This feeling was not unpleasant. On the contrary, it sharpened the senses. The softness of night was balanced by the sharpness of morning. Animals slowly became active. First faint sounds, then clearer movements. A horse lifting its head, a sheep shifting position. The village was not forced to wake. Everything happened in its own time. As morning approached, the sky changed color. It did not brighten. It became a tone between gray and blue, cold but clean. This light made the village appear simpler than it was. Walls, fences, houses, everything was as it was. Nothing hidden, nothing exaggerated. When people began to wake, conversations were brief. The day was not planned yet. First the body woke, then the mind. Nothing was rushed, because rushing was thought to spoil the day. In Viking villages, time was not something in short supply. The silence left from the evening was still felt. Thoughts unspoken during the night were not carried into the morning. Each day was not seen as a clean page, but yesterday remained in yesterday. Life was a continuous flow. This was where the meaning of an evening was completed. Evening was not only the end of a day, but the herald of the next. The calm given by night carried into morning. That was why evenings were important to Vikings. They set the tone of the morning. When the village became active again, no one said the night has passed. Because night did not disappear, it simply withdrew. Until the next evening, an evening in Viking village is not something told loudly, but it is remembered for a long time. The lingering trace of the fire, the sound the wind leaves on the walls, the thoughts hidden inside the night. All are carried into the morning, and life, from where it stands, continues quietly.